Welcome to Independence Avenue Media. I'm Michelle, and it's my pleasure today to be talking to the founder and CEO of HarrisX, Dritan Nesho. And this is a company that's been researching very consistently since full-scale invasion started in Ukraine since 2022, public opinions of Americans related to Ukraine, related to Russia, to the war, and many other things. And I cannot wait to get into this conversation with you. Thank you so much for making the time to talk to us, and you're in your beautiful office here.
Thank you very much for having me. And at the outset, I would like to say that I very much admire the work that you are doing and Independence Avenue Media is doing to preserve free speech, not just around the world, and in so many countries in Central and Eastern Europe and in the Caucasus and the Balkans and beyond, but also in Washington in its own ways. And that's incredible work.
Thank you very much. Thank you for saying that. Let's dive in. President Trump, over the years, how would you assess, especially the second term, how would you assess, is his ratings, his approval rating still the same? Is it changing? What's your view on that?
Well, I would say that his approval ratings, as you can see very clearly in the average of all the polls, are underwater by quite a bit. Let's say the average is somewhere around 40% job approval today, with 60% not approving of the way that the White House is leading the country, and certainly the direction of the economy, the country writ large, and several policy initiatives. That said, what's fascinating in the current moment and the dynamic is that Trump can still rebound before the midterm elections. He can rebound
before the midterm.
That's
only a few months.
Yes, in spite of everything, and that's really because of two factors. Voters are not quite clear on what the Democrats stand for ahead of the midterms, and the Democratic Party has no clear leadership. So the Democrats are winning by having faded into the background and allowing Trump to make mistakes, fundamentally, in the eyes of voters. And that is a situation that allows for Trump to reclaim the mantle of leadership, especially if he brings about a solution to the Iran conflict, to inflation and the affordability crisis, or even begins to take steps to do that.
Do you think that could hurt or help Democrats in that what you just described, that Trump could rebound before the midterms?
It depends on two factors. It depends how loud the voice of the Democratic Socialists of America, the far left of the Democratic Party, is, and whether or not they hijack the platform of the party, pushing it towards socialism and pushing it more towards the populism of the left. That can define the Democrats in a way that if voters are posed with a choice between a set of more socialist policies and more capitalist, free market-driven policies, they will always choose capitalism and free market. It's in the nature of American voters. So this is one vector or variable that needs to be factored in, and it could be potentially damaging to the Democrats. The other element is where we stand in terms of inflation and affordability. President Trump ultimately was brought in to bring down inflation, address affordability issues, and he hasn't so far done that. In fact, you could argue the opposite, that he has fueled inflation and affordability concerns with the conflict in Iran and the rise of oil prices. So it depends whether or not this conflict stabilizes in public opinion and obviously in its dynamic, in reality, and whether or not the Democrats are seen as offering pragmatic solutions from the center and able to build a big tent ahead of the midterm elections and beyond, or whether their voice is being hijacked by the far left, the Democratic Socialists of America.
If I understood you right, the American voters, a large majority, is centrist, is oriented on market economy. What's causing this deviation from these principles from both parties, but now it's more visible from the Democratic Party side?
Well, what we've noticed in the United States really since the great financial crisis in 2008 is the rise of populism. Mm-hmm. Populism within the right started with the Tea Party, but then it evolved into the MAGA movement. And then populism in the left, it started with Bernie Sanders and is now evolved into, the so-called Democratic Socialists of America with Mamdani, Mayor Mamdani, and AOC, and several other members of Congress. Both these populist camps on the far left and the far right, I would say, represent 15 to 20% of the country, or of voters. 15 to 20 on one side, 15 to 20 on another side. But 60% remains focused on pragmatic solutions, problem solving. They want compromise and they want a path forward. And this is comprised really of the traditional side of the Republican Party, the traditional side of the Democratic Party, the centrists, and then independent voters, who are always the swing voters in any given election. You could say that the largest party in America is these independent voters, these problem-solving voters, but no one is speaking to them. And they are then being forced to make a choice between two extremes, on one side or another. And you saw it in the last time around between Kamala Harris, which kowtowed more to the extremes of the left, and Donald Trump, who rehabilitated himself and represents more the extremes of the right. They picked the extremes of the right. He was the devil that they know. And so this really also highlights that American voters, their median point is center-right. It has always been center-right. And this is why it's such an interesting situation in terms of how the Democrats self-identify themselves ahead of the midterm and what Trump is able to do to correct his position between now and then.
And very briefly about the midterms coming up. Do you have data on that can guide your analysis in a particular way?
Sure. Well, I will mention for your viewers, we conduct a monthly public policy poll with Harvard University. They can find it every month at harvardharrispoll.com. And we track all of these variables and all the latest policy issues. And it's a wealth of information that frankly is being made available to the public to understand the evolution of politics in America. What you notice there is exactly this interesting dynamic where Donald Trump in our latest poll was at 42% job approval, but the midterm question was split 50-50 between Democrats and Republicans. So again, they don't quite like the performance of Trump, but he gains support and Republicans gain support when it comes to the midterm because no one has framed the choice. They don't quite know what they're voting for on the Democratic side of the equation. So the country is very split, the country remains polarized, and this election is still a toss-up election. Things are not going in the favor and the direction of Donald Trump, but that can change very quickly depending on what he's able to achieve with Iran and the negotiating process.
We are seeing some major shifts in MAGA, especially as it relates to foreign policy. Does Trump still have support from MAGA that he did when he came back the second time?
He has overwhelming support on MAGA. And I will offer an analogy for your viewers to understand how tied MAGA is to Trump and how tied Trump is to MAGA. MAGA voters have been anti-interventionist. They wanted Trump to come in and not pursue wars in the Middle East and beyond. When Trump attacked Iran, which was a conflict of choice to an extent, of course with goals from the administration, but still a conflict of choice, 90% of MAGA supported him in the decision. They held a policy position different than what they stated during the last election in 2024 because their leader told them that was the right thing. And still today, 90% of MAGA overall supports Trump, believes that he's doing a good job. There's a famous expression by President Bill Clinton that goes something along the lines of Republicans want to fall in line and Democrats want to fall in love with their leaders. And so I think that that tells a lot about the position of Trump vis-a-vis his base, and also why he's able to affect their perceptions and their support for any international conflict or any issue in a degree that we haven't seen before.
You are, as I mentioned at the top, HarrisX is one of the, not just American, but one of the Western public opinion research or polling and analysis organization that's been monitoring what's happening in Ukraine since the full-scale invasion. Throughout this time, you've been monitoring what Americans think about the war, about Ukraine and Russia. Can you just summarize that? Have you seen a change since 2022 and now? And what is that change? Which way are people changing?
Sure. I would say that Americans in general love solutions and love compromise. And especially when it comes to conflicts that either at a minimum they cost money and resources and attention, but on the other extreme they could claim lives and claim some very, very harsh and tangible costs. They are willing to go along with an initiative in the beginning, but their patience burns out quickly. And so I would say that if you look at the conflict in Ukraine or Russia's war on Ukraine, if you look at the conflict in Gaza, right, between Israel and Hamas, both Israel and Ukraine very similarly started at 80% support amongst the American public and the American base. And today that support is a bare majority, a very slight majority, which could tip one way or another. That's a reflection of this dynamic, and that's a reflection of the fact that this public does not like open-ended wars, tires out from them, and more often than not, open-ended conflicts and wars end up claiming the leadership that pushes for them or starts them. And I think that this is a consistent dynamic through which to look at the Ukraine conflict, Israel-Hamas conflict, and then certainly now the Iran conflict that we're seeing play out in real time.
So that's about the conflict itself. Is there a difference between the conflict or war in Ukraine and Ukraine as a country?
Well, there's very strong goodwill towards Ukrainians, right? But voters in the United States view this from the lens or from the perspective of the war. And what they see is a war that has reached a stalemate with, lines not moving one way or another, and a war that without a clear end in sight requires some kind of solution. This is what Trump is seizing on in his various initiatives. Now, they don't always agree with Trump in terms of how he's approaching the war. By a factor of 2 to 1, they believe that he is too harsh on Zelenskyy and he's too lenient on Putin, and they'd like to see a stronger posture vis-a-vis Russia and vis-a-vis Putin. But what they support is a compromise solution. And this is ultimately what is driving the position of the administration, plus the president's own personal views on, both of the leaders and how that factors into the dynamic of the war.
Do you think some of the influencers have impact on that, especially on the Republican side or MAGA side? And I'm specifically asking about Laura Loomer was in Ukraine, and there is a tremendous momentum at the moment. Things seem to be going in a more positive direction for Ukraine at the moment. So do you think some of those voices inside the Republican or MAGA movement do actually impact public opinion?
They do impact public opinion. My big question on Laura Loomer is, did she have this about turn on Ukraine, this change in position, on her own accord, or was she asked to change her position on Ukraine by the White House in order to justify a shift in position on Ukraine? And that has very real implications. Number one, that gives the White House leverage when they're negotiating vis-a-vis the Russians. Number two, that could be a factor of the fact that, as it's wildly now being written and rumored, that the Russians are providing the Iranians with coordinates and support on how to target American troops in the Middle East. And that's something that Trump cannot accept. And if it becomes public that he is lenient towards Putin while Putin is helping kill American soldiers, then that would be a very, very big problem for him. That would be a moment where his own base turns on him. So I think it's a real interesting set of events that we're noticing. This is actually very favorable for President Zelenskyy and from Ukraine, because it allows them to gain the share of influence and voice that they need to have with the Trump administration in order to defend Ukraine's positions better than they've been defended up until now. Not because of lack of willingness, and President Zelenskyy played a weak hand very well up until now, but because in Donald Trump's mind up until now, the relationship with Russia was more valuable than the relationship with Ukraine. If that perception changes, then America's position on the war will change, and that will be to Ukraine's benefit.
So it's not the other way around. It's President Trump changes his views, and then what happens? Then how does the public opinion follow President's decision?
The Ukraine has a strong base of support within Democrats and independents. It's really the Republican voters that have wavered in its support, in part because of the influence that Trump has on them. The other thing is that Ukraine's fight with Russia is very much a David and Goliath story that speaks to American evangelicals who are naturally positively predisposed towards Ukraine and Ukraine's effort and fight, but have been second-guessed in terms of their natural support by President Trump or the MAGA movement or these political rhymes on the Republican side of the spectrum. And so this is a realignment or a recalibration, which will be beneficial to Ukraine and something to keep an eye out on, and also to keep an eye out on what kind of interference do the Russians run on this. Do they send their emissaries now to offer bigger trade deals to the United States, and will Trump believe that? And that's obviously the other side. So I think this will play out over the next several months in interesting ways.
What do Americans think about the Russians? And then what do they think about Putin?
Well, they don't like Putin, for sure. I don't know what they think about Russians, right? But I think that there's an American expression that Russians charm you with their suffering. And so they have suffered as much, if not more, at the hands of their own government and regime as others have. But I can tell you very clearly what they currently think about the war. And this is part of a major study that we conducted with GlobeSec, the security conference based out of the Czech Republic and Prague, where fundamentally 56% of Americans today, support Ukraine's fight against Russia and believe that it's important for their own national security purposes. They are wanting, a slight majority want a solution sooner rather than later. But what's interesting is close to 70% support a continued fight in order to reach a peace deal that is both honorable and self-standing, or will survive, rather than rush into any kind of deal that then will fall apart. And so that is a good starting point from where to build. And really Americans, we looked also at most European publics and voters, in addition to Americans, they're the center. They're the middle of public opinion across the West when it comes to Ukraine. And again, the middle is still favorable towards Ukraine, in spite of everything that has happened in the last 18 months.
Do you think, especially as it comes to the European side of your work, are the public sentiments, which you just talked about, reflected in the policies of the national government?
It's a fantastic question. Actually, Europeans are much more supportive of what the Americans are doing than what their own governments are doing. Not on substance, but on proactive posture. They hope, or they would have hoped, that their governments would have taken a much more proactive position to support Ukraine earlier and on a stronger footing and basis. And secondly, to try to bring about some kind of a resolution to this war in Europe. So while they don't like Trump, they actually like Trump's posture and his dynamic engagement to trying to find a solution in the war, more so than what they're seeing from their own leaders. That is a fascinating paradox amongst Europeans, and I'm speaking of Germans and French and Italians here. They all roughly fall into the same camp.
How do Europeans view the war in Ukraine? Do they feel threatened because of that war?
They do, and I think that this relates very closely to their views of the United States and NATO. Mm-hmm. There's a growing sense and sentiment that Europe needs to stand up on its own from a military and defense perspective, and overwhelmingly across European publics, they support more investment in the military and the development of a European command and control structure that is their own, outside of NATO. But at the same time, an overwhelming majority, 70%, want the United States to be in Europe and to be involved and engaged. And only 30%, or about a third, believe that Europe is prepared for a crisis or a major war. So there's a confidence gap that is very clear.
And the threat coming from Russia.
Especially the threat coming from Russia.
Yeah. And the perception of that threat
yes. I mean, it's
present.
It's seen as a clear and present danger. I mean, I will read you sort of to get, because it's a lot of countries and a lot of numbers. But when you ask, is Ukraine's fight against Russia important for the security of your own country? Across Europe, 2/3 say yes, on average, which is striking.
Yeah. There's also something very striking in one of your polls, where Europeans' desire to be protected versus their willingness to defend their countries has also some major gaps. What are those numbers, and how do you explain that?
Sure. Well, as I said, we looked at it through many different lenses, and this is the key question heading into the NATO summit in Ankara and also coming out of the NATO summit in Ankara. So when we asked, do you support increasing national defense spending, on average 2/3 of European voters support it. And then when we asked, should the EU have its own army, the number is higher still. It's close to 3/4 of Europeans that support their own army. Are you willing to defend your country in the case of a foreign attack? 62%, close to 2/3 on average, say yes, which is an important statistic. Do you feel personally prepared for such a situation? It drops to 40%. And then, do you feel that your country is prepared for a major crisis? It drops further still to the low 30%. So again, this is the confidence gap that we are seeing within European publics, and really this requires leadership. This requires communication, a vision and a plan, and the ability to execute against that.
Has there been a similar study done in the US?
Yes, there is a similar study. We have the statistics for the United States. So 74% of Americans are willing to defend their country in a case of a foreign attack. 55% feel personally prepared, so 15 points higher than the average in Europe. And 64% believe that their country is ready for a major crisis. Double what we're seeing in Europe. So you see a
Americans are confident.
very different picture when it comes to the United States and Europe.
Now, that's fascinating. We can talk about that for another hour, about those specific numbers. But let's move to NATO, particularly what Americans think about NATO. What are your numbers telling you?
Look, Americans agree with Trump that Europe needs to pay its fair share of defense spending.
Even Europeans agree with
Even
that.
Europeans agree with that, based on these numbers. But they believe that the pursuit of Greenland is a folly, and this is the biggest friction point between Europeans and Americans within the framework of NATO at this stage. And if they were forced to choose, and we ask this as a choice question, would you support the United States acquiring Greenland by whatever means possible in order to control more of its economic resources and build it within its security umbrella, or would you want to preserve America's role in NATO and that alliance? 70% would choose
70%.
NATO over Greenland.
Yeah.
So by a factor of 2 to 1, and this splits the Republican base, and this splits even the MAGA base. Trump has not sold the concept to his own base. And this is something that Europeans should find reassurance in. There are many leaders in the United States Senate that say, approach this calmly, right? It's not a cause for a major rupture in the transatlantic relationship. It's hard when you look at the rhetoric, but the reality is that Trump doesn't have the political leverage to see this through.
Yeah. What do Americans think about the role of Congress? How Congress has been sort of pushed aside, or is choosing to be pushed aside under this administration?
It has a 28% approval rating. So if Trump is at 42, Congress is at 28, and the political parties are somewhere in between. No, the country is unhappy with Congress.
There was a claim that President Zelenskyy had a higher job approval rating in the U.S. than President Trump did. Have you heard anything about that?
No, I'm not aware of that. It's depending on when the poll was conducted. I believe it, right? But the thing with President Trump, which is quite fascinating, is that he has always been a high floor, low ceiling politician. In the sense that America, you can divide into, once they actually go to the voting booth, it's really a 40-40 country. 40% will break towards the Democrats, 40% will break towards the Republican, and the 20% in the middle decide which way elections go. You could say that, given that we are polarized, that's even smaller now, that group. So when you look at his approval rating, he carries his base. Today, he carries over 90% of all Republicans with him in terms of support, with very few defections. 90% of Democrats are squarely against him, maybe even more. And it's really the independents in the middle that break 60-40 against him and kind of give him the approval rating that he has. He's never been one, even though he's obsessed with the size of his crowds, or has been obsessed publicly with the size of his crowd, he's never been a miscongeniality, someone that wants overwhelming support or overwhelming approach. He has his 45%, and circumstances have it that is enough to win in elections in the United States right now, which really highlights the weakness of the opposition, the Democratic Party. The weakness of the Democratic Party today coming out of the 2024 election. But as a Democrat myself, I would say that the rehabilitation of Donald Trump after January the 6th is something that needs to be studied very closely. The reason why he was able to come back into power is because the Democrats made a lot of mistakes in the last administration and beyond. And so Nothing ever happens without a reason, and elections always offer a choice. And the voters spoke very clearly in 2024 that would rather go back to Trump than continue with what was being offered to them by way as a continuation of the Biden administration.
Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
your time and for hosting us here at your office, and good luck to you.
Thank you very much.